One night, when I was little, my parents rented the movie All the President's Men. I was so inspired by watching Woodward and Bernstein tear down the Nixon White House that I immediately decided I wanted to work for a newspaper when I grew up. The idea of becoming a crusader reporter fighting the corrupt establishment led me to look at Columbia University's Columbia School of Journalism, and thanks to good grades, a scholarship, and a sizable student loan, I succeeded. Columbia gave me three priceless things: an excellent education, a reasonable chance of getting an entry-level job in the media after graduation, and a beautiful wife. Let me say a few words about each. Columbia is one of the preeminent journalism schools in the country, and it taught me not only the fundamentals of research, reporting, and news writing, but also skills in investigative reporting, broadcast journalism, and digital media. My teachers included both experienced journalists and famous professors. The only thing they didn't teach me was how to find work in the ultra-competitive journalism market. Not only is there a glut of reporters, editors, and news outlets, but the industry itself is in serious decline, at least in the newspaper industry. And if you do find a job, the pay will be meager at best. It was an uninviting environment into which I headed as my college years drew to a close. As graduation approached, I was so desperate for a job that I seriously considered taking an unpaid internship just to get some credentials. But at the last minute, good old Columbia put in a good word for me. Not the employment department, but the alumni relations department. It turned out that a good friend of my father was a graduate of Columbia University and offered me a job as an assistant proofreader for a newspaper in Washington, D.C. It was not what I had imagined, but a drowning man was clutching at straws. One of the reasons I was so desperate for a job was that in between my class schedule and reporting, I somehow found time to fall in love. In fact, I even went so far as to get engaged my senior year. Nicole was, as I assumed, a political science major, and we met in a comparative politics class our freshman year. She was smart, articulate, ambitious, and gorgeous. What began as a classroom friendship quickly developed into an increasingly close emotional and physical relationship. I have found that the passion she brings to political debates matches the passion she brought to our relationship. Simply put, we couldn't get enough of each other, and it didn't take us long to realize that we wanted much more, and for much longer, than just a few years in college. Unlike me, Nika's future was well planned. A good friend of Nikki's parents was a third-term congressman from her district, and he promised their daughter a job as an assistant in his Washington office when she graduated. So it was luck that I found a job in Washington, and we got married right after graduation. Even though we both had jobs, we found that we could only afford a tiny apartment outside Bethesda. But when you're young and in love, this only brings minor inconvenience. Nikki delved into the inner workings of Capitol Hill and found a new environment that she really enjoyed. As for me, I was glad that I had a job, but I was not at all impressed with my responsibilities. Proofreading other people's texts didn't mesh well with my dream of becoming a crusader reporter. But as I kept reminding myself, it was better than being unemployed and would probably lead to something better. As it turns out, this is exactly what happened, Ed, but not in the way I expected. One afternoon, I was called into my boss's office, and as I sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair across from his desk, he stared at me with an appraising look that made me feel very uncomfortable. Finally, he held up a piece of paper that I recognized as my resume. It says here that you can write. This is true? Yes, sir, I answered seriously. And it also says that you're a pretty smart guy, at least a scientist. Right? Well, I guess I did well at school, I said modestly. I graduated with honors, but I didn't think now was the right time to brag about it. He sighed heavily. Okay, here's my proposal. Agatha Cornwell retires next week. That means someone has to take over her column. I swallowed hard. Agatha Cornwell was certainly not an intrepid reporter. In fact, she wasn't a reporter at all. She wrote the newspaper's daily advice in a column for lovers. In most cases, none of the employees even read this column. and when they did, it was always the subject of ridicule. Writing in it was the worst task, even worse than writing obituaries. The boss must have mistaken my reaction for enthusiasm. Don't get your hopes up. The truth is that this column has one of the lowest reader ratings of any section of the newspaper. But she has a few loyal followers, so the editor-in-chief doesn't want to kill her and cause an uproar. And we don't want Agatha's readers to know that the old bat has disappeared too, so don't tell anyone that you're the new Aunt Agatha. I nodded understandingly. He has nothing to worry about. The last thing I would want is for anyone who knows me to hear that I am now writing an advice column. He glanced at me again with a steely gaze. Don't screw it up, okay? I nodded and left his office to retreat to my desk and begin to bemoan my fate. Advice column. How will I ever be able to hold my head up in front of Nikki and our friends? If word got out about this, I'd be the laughingstock of Columbia Journalism School. My only saving grace was that, thanks to my boss's ban, I couldn't tell anyone about my new assignment. But even this was a small consolation. Great, I thought sadly. Not only do I have the worst job at the newspaper, but I can't even complain to anyone about it. When I got home that evening, Nikki asked me why I had such a sad face, but I made up some story about a hard day at the office, and luckily she didn't press me because she wanted to tell me about her job. She was excited because it turned out that her new boss was making a lot of noise in political circles. Congressmen are usually a dime a dozen in Washington, but Timothy Vickers was quickly becoming a rising star in his party. He was young, handsome, and extremely eloquent. He and his wife turned out to be a very photogenic couple. There was already talk that more was in store for him. One of the other aides told me that he might be considered as a possible candidate for vice president. Nikki told me excitedly. Just think, someday I'll be able to work in the White House. I'm afraid I wasn't as happy about her luck as I should have been. I was happy for her, but inside I think I was still feeling sorry for myself about my new assignment. On Monday morning, I was shown around my new workspace, and to my surprise, I discovered that I actually now had a tiny office. At least it was some compensation for such humiliating work. However, as soon as I sat down at the old wooden table, I immediately found myself in a snowstorm. There were random piles of letters and papers everywhere. I felt lost, with no idea where to start. At that moment, there was a light knock, and a pretty young woman about my age poked her head through the door. "Hello?" she said. "I'm Mandy. I am your assistant." "Assistant? Do I have an office and an assistant? Maybe things won't be so bad after all?" "Hi, Mandy. I'm Casey," I said, "and I'm completely lost. Please come in and tell me what's going on here." She smiled at me cheerfully, plopped down on the tiny chair next to my tiny desk, and began talking. I soon learned that Mandy had only been working with Agatha for 3 months, and that she was also not happy with her appointment. "It's not exactly real journalism," she admitted, "but after a while it will grow into you. All these people are desperate for advice, and you start to feel like you're doing something worthwhile by trying to help them." She gave me a stack of prints of Agatha's latest columns to read, and I soon had a mental image of a kind-hearted elderly woman working week after week to impart a little wisdom and common sense to her flock of hopelessly insecure people. Mandy then showed me several letters that arrived relentlessly every day. When I looked at them, I thought that the questions Aunt Agatha received were tiresomely banal. When I asked Mandy about it, she winked at me and handed me another stack of letters. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled shyly. These are all questions that Agatha did not want to answer. She was simply uncomfortable talking about certain topics, especially those that she considered weird or indecent. Wow. When I started reading letters from the second pile, I quickly realized that we had a lot of strange and indecent readers. I grinned at Mandy. "I don't claim to have that much experience in this area, but I promise that we will stop avoiding questions about indecent topics. This is what people love to read about, and we will start giving it to them." She gave me a worried look. I'm happy with everything, but I don't know how management will react. It took them quite a while to get used to sugar, spice, and all the good stuff, if you know what I mean. Look, I didn't ask for this task, I told her, but now that I've been assigned it, I'm going to do it my way. If the boss doesn't like it, he can put someone else in my place. Are you with me? She smiled. Okay, count on me. Luckily, Agatha had prepared her column several days in advance, so I had a slight head start. She allowed me to spend some time going through the letters in the unanswered file and choosing the ones I wanted to use in my first column. I also thought a lot about the style I wanted to go with. I definitely planned to provide answers that reflected my own beliefs, but I wanted to do so without indicating my attitude. After a few failed attempts, I felt comfortable enough to submit a few excerpts from my first draft to Mandy for review. Dear Aunt Agatha, I love my wife, but I recently discovered that I am bi. Now I want to experiment with the guys I've met. Since I don't have relationships with other women, I don't feel like I'm cheating on my wife. What do you think? Bisexual. Dear bisexual, I don't care if you're left-handed, right-handed, or work with both hands, but it's still cheating. Dear Aunt Agatha, my husband and I have been happily married for 10 years, but recently I had an affair with a man in my office. I feel terrible about what I did. Should I confess and beg for his forgiveness? Repentant Roberta. Dear Repentant Roberta, if you confess to your husband, all you will do is take the guilt off your shoulders and put all the pain on him. Keep everything to yourself and correct your mistakes by becoming a better wife. Guilt is the price you pay for knowing it's wrong. Dear Aunt Agatha, a married guy from my office sent me a photo of his genitals on my cell phone. What should I do? Nasty. Dear Nasty, why don't you forward his sexy message to his wife and get her opinion? I bet she'll have it. Mandy looked at me with a sly smile. I don't know if management will like it, but at least they won't be able to say your column is boring. Sure enough, that same day, my boss burst into my office with the column I had sent to press. What the hell are you doing, Casey? He shouted. Aunt Agatha's readers are a lot of dear old ladies. By doing this, you will needlessly piss them off. I didn't agree with this. You asked me to do a job, and I did it. Why don't you give her a chance before you kill her? He huffed angrily and walked out, but let things take their course. In addition to the print edition, the newspaper also appeared in a web version, which gave us the opportunity to receive feedback almost instantly. Mandy told me that the Ask Aunt Agatha column had never gotten much of a response, so I was surprised when she came to my office the next day and used my computer to look up online reviews of my column. Apparently, my first attempt got a good response. Some readers condemned Aunt Agatha for being frivolous in serious matters, but others applauded her for her strong stance. I wasn't expecting any answers at all, so I was a little nervous about the storm I was causing. But Mandy was excited. This is the biggest reaction to Aunt Agatha's column I've ever seen, she said. I still wasn't sure. Some people definitely didn't like what I said or how I said it, I pointed out. Who cares? She exclaimed joyfully. At least you made them think about it. Over the next few days, the same reaction to the column as the first time repeated itself. Comments continued to pour in both for and against the new tone and topic. I could only wonder how management reacted to all this. Over the next 2 weeks, I found the answer to the question I asked myself when starting my new job. Why do I need an assistant? When I saw the bundle of letters that arrived, I began to understand, and when Mandy showed me how to check Aunt Agatha's email, I began to wonder if 2 people would be enough to handle the influx. Every piece of mail and email had to be read, dated, and categorized. Some will go into the requires response file, some will go into the ignore file, and some will go into the think about it later file. We then discussed the first category questions and decided how to answer them. Sometimes we didn't see eye to eye. For example, one day Mandy laughed while reading a letter that came in the mail. This is in the trash, she grinned. It's clearly a fake. But when I read it, I realized it should be in the next day's column. Dear Aunt Agatha, I was recently awakened from a deep sleep by a little green man who took me on his spaceship and examined my body with the help of alien instruments. Yesterday I found out that I am pregnant. What should I do? Abducted by aliens. Dear alien abductee, you need to take this letter to your creative writing professor and tell him I'm asking him to give you an F. The following Friday afternoon, I had just finished preparing my Monday column when the boss showed up at my door. I had been avoiding him since our last meeting, and his sudden appearance immediately worried me. I just received the latest report on the number of visits to our online site, he said with a frown, and also a report on the reviews your column receives. I held my breath. Readers may not always like your smart remarks, he continued, but at least they read them. Visits to Ask Aunt Agatha are up 35%. I think you can keep your job for another week. After which he flew out of my office. I was stunned. I felt like that actress who exclaimed at the Oscars, "You like me? You really like me." Mandy was eavesdropping and came running to give me a big hug. Congratulations, Casey. This is a remarkable result, and the boss almost never tells anyone about it personally. He must be really pleased. I hugged her back and did a John Wayne imitation. Oh, nonsense, ma'am. This is bullshit. But the truth was that I felt damn good. I may not have had the job I wanted, but at least I had some success in the job I was given. That evening, I was driving home, and my only regret was that I couldn't tell Nikki everything. I didn't have to think about it for long, though, because when I got home, Nikki reminded me that we were going away for the weekend. Her boss, Congressman Vickers, was holding a retreat at the Y River estate of a wealthy sponsor, with the spouses of his employees and other significant others invited. I think it's because of my background as a journalist, but I'm pretty cynical about most elected officials. Hearing the clean congressman, as the media dubbed him, preach about family values and personal morality made me feel more than a little uncomfortable. As a result, I wasn't going to rub elbows with Congressman Vickers and his entourage, but Nikki was euphoric, so I kept my feelings to myself. And then, when I had some time to talk to him over cocktails, I had to admit that he was a charming but serious guy. The next day, while Nikki and the other staff were meeting with him, I had the opportunity to meet Mrs. Vickers and had an even more favorable impression. I expected to see one of those plastic Stepford wives with a prepared campaign speech, ready to speak on her husband's behalf at a moment's notice. What I found instead was a quiet, thoughtful woman whose only flaw was a clearly visible limp. Without any questioning from me, she said that the limp was the result of a car accident that occurred shortly after their wedding. It was terrible, she admitted, and besides, I can't have children, but I'm lucky to be alive, so I'm not complaining. I was impressed by her courage, as well as her husband's decision to stay with her. Maybe he's one of the good guys after all, I told myself. That night in our room, Nikki was very excited. He said he was very pleased with my work, she told me excitedly. He said he really relies on my help. Taking off my clothes, I asked, "Why don't you come over here and see if you can help me out a little?" It didn't take long to turn her enthusiasm into passion, and soon we were enjoying each other to the fullest. When Nikki comes to the finish line, she is very loud, and I was even worried that her moans and screams might disturb others in the house. But I get so excited when she gets turned on, especially as she approaches climax, that I stopped worrying about it and became immersed in our mutual pleasure. Afterwards, just before falling asleep, I thought, it turned out to be a pretty good weekend after all. On Sunday morning, we sat on the patio and had breakfast. Nikki, of course, read the Washington Post, but out of loyalty to me, she also took a copy of my newspaper. I was surprised to see her turn to the Life section and begin reading Ask Aunt Agatha. "Why are you reading this?" I asked her. "I think I'm like everyone else. I like to read about other people's secrets," she readily admitted. "Besides, Aunt Agatha has become much more interesting lately, and I really like her advice." Here, I almost let it slip, but I could hardly restrain myself. She would be surprised if she found out, I thought joyfully. Over the next few weeks, I became completely comfortable in my new role. Some of the work was made easier by Mandy, who was a pleasure to work with. From our conversations over dinner, I learned that her background was similar to mine. Like me, she always wanted to be a reporter. Instead of Columbia University, she attended the University of Missouri, also nationally recognized for its excellent journalism school. And like me, she had no luck finding a job as a reporter after graduation. She became an assistant only when management realized that Aunt Agatha needed help. By working together, we could now plan the column rather than just react every day. We started tailoring the emails to respond to so that they fit certain topics and responded more logically to what was happening in the outside world. No more letters about summer romances appearing around Christmas. Mandy was also a skilled researcher, tracking down resources that Aunt Agatha could direct her readers to when they needed expert help. This actually came in handy the day we received an email from a young reader. "Dear Aunt Agatha, I am 14 years old and I don't know who else to turn to. My friends and I snorted heroin to get high. At first everything was fine, but then I started vomiting and now I often feel dizzy. I'm scared and don't know what to do. My mom and dad said they would kick me out if they ever caught me doing drugs or anything. Please help. Lonely in Alexandria." How stupid parents can be. I was furious when Mandy showed me this letter. Their daughter may have serious health problems, and they have cut off all lines of communication with her. Then, another terrible thought occurred to me. What if she's really in bad shape? It is not enough for us to publish the answer in the newspaper. There must be some way to get to her right now. Mandy quickly brought me back to reality. We don't have her phone number or address, and the email account she provided is almost certainly fictitious. But there must be a way to find out who she is and where she lives, I answered disappointedly. Do a little research to find out where this girl needs to go for help, and I'll go talk to Amir. Maybe he knows how we can contact her. Amir was our technical specialist. If there was anything he didn't know about networks, computers, and the internet, no one had discovered it yet. When I found him and explained the situation, he scratched his head thoughtfully. "This is a difficult question," he said. "Email usually passes through so many servers that the original point of origin is almost impossible to find. But I have a good friend who works for the NSA, and if anyone can do it, it's them." I encouraged him to do whatever he could to help and went back to see how Mandy was doing. She found a free clinic in the Alexandria area that specializes in working with teens with drug addiction. Knowing that it was unlikely that we would immediately locate our 14-year-old girl, we decided that the best thing we could do was reply to her email and hope that Lonely would check her mailbox and see Aunt Agatha's response. Then, as a backup, we published the same answer in the newspaper. All we could do was hope she saw one and got help before it was too late. For the next 2 days, nothing happened, and Mandy and I were very depressed. Then everything happened at once. Amir jumped up to us, waving a piece of paper in his hand. "Eat," he said excitedly. "My friend found it." Before he could give me his home email address for Lonely, Mandy arrived with a printout. "She received your advice," she shouted, and we quickly read the letter. "Dear Aunt Agatha, I went to the place you recommended, and they helped me a lot. I stopped feeling sick, and now I don't feel dizzy. In fact, I feel so much better that I'm going to try to convince my girlfriends not to use heroin anymore. Thank you. Aunt alone in Alexandria." I just looked at Mandy and shook my head. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this latest event. But at least we got there. Mandy assured me, "At least your column did something." I hoped she was right. A few weeks later, my boss came into my office with his usual scowl. "I don't know what's wrong with you, kid, but you're definitely the luckiest son of a bitch I know." By now, I was expecting such outbursts, so I just looked at him and said, "Okay, what did I do now?" For reasons unknown to me, your little column of constant whining has attracted a lot of attention. The number of your readers is off the charts, and some newspapers have apparently found out about it. The point is that your stupid column will be reprinted. Once the lawyers can work out the details, a dozen other newspapers across the country will begin publishing Ask Aunt Agatha. As I sat there stunned, Mandy walked in and asked a good question. "What about money?" The boss rolled his eyes. "We have a very clear policy on this. Any author whose work makes a profit shares the income with the newspaper 50-50, he explained with a pained expression on his face. If you keep it up, you can get into syndication and make money that's usually reserved for the big boys. Mandy squealed and hugged my neck. We both screamed and danced around the room while the boss looked at us with disgust. After he left the office, Mandy kissed me hard on the cheek and said, "Oh, Casey, congratulations. It's so wonderful. I always knew that you were special." "We are a team," I told her. "I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled and kissed me again. "How sweet you say, but it was you who took the risk and shook everything up. It was you who left your mark on the column, and you are the one who deserves all the success you are going to achieve." On the way home, I was so excited that I couldn't wait to tell Nikki the good news. But she got home very late, and when she finally arrived, all she wanted to talk about was her boss, the congressman. It seemed that the party was actively looking for a new face for the upcoming convention, and the name Clean Congressman began to be widely circulated as a vice presidential candidate. Nikki kept going on and on about what a great vice president he would be, and what a role she would play in his campaign. I tried to listen with interest, but I was starting to feel like the second violin in Nika's orchestra. "Hey," I said half-jokingly, "don't forget about me in all your plans." She waved her hand slightly. "You are a simple editor," she said dismissively, "and he goes for gold. Someday he could become President of the United States." She must have noticed the reaction on my face because she quickly tried to correct what she said. "I mean, I'm sure what you're doing is important for the newspaper, but it's unlikely to go down in the history books." It really hurt, and I turned to leave before I said anything terrible. She reached out to stop me, but before she could, her phone rang. When she answered, it was someone from the congressman's office, and she was soon drawn into the conversation. I went outside and took a long walk around our neighborhood. I, of course, realized that what she said was true. If her congressman actually made it to the White House, he would become famous, and deservedly so. But this did not give her the right to humiliate her husband like that. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that Nikki's respect for me had noticeably dropped since she entered the congressman's inner circle. I could understand her enthusiasm for her job, but not her lack of enthusiasm for her husband. Considering what she thought of me, I decided not to tell her anything about my upcoming syndication. After all, that could be months away, and even then it still wouldn't be as exciting for Nikki as her boss's VP nomination. When I returned from my walk, Nikki tried to act as if nothing had happened. We were polite to each other, but not affectionate. No matter how unhappy I was with the state of my marriage, I still needed to publish a column every day. But my home life inevitably spilled over into my work. A few days later, I found a hopelessly romantic email in my inbox, and in my bad mood, I decided to come down hard on the writer. "Dear Aunt Agatha, I fell in love with a wonderful guy in my office. He is smart, funny, and caring, not to mention handsome. The only problem is that he is married. Should I tell him how I really feel about him? His secret admirer? Dear secret admirer, read my lips. Keep your feelings to yourself. No matter how strong your love is, you have no right to ruin this guy's marriage. Until he becomes single, you will have to keep your feelings to yourself. If it's too painful for you, find another job." Aunt Agatha picked up on a little heartbreak from the romantics in her audience who wanted to give the secret admirer a chance. But at that point, there were plenty of others with marriage problems behind me, and I wasn't about to back down. Conditions in the house continued to deteriorate. Nikki's job kept her late at the office all the time, and her travel increased so much that I could only find out when she would be home by checking a copy of her itinerary receipt, which she left in her home office. She was constantly flying out with the congressman to attend fundraisers or participate in strategy sessions with party sages. When she managed to return home, she was so exhausted that she did little except sleep and eat. And when I say slept, I mean it. Any other activities before bed became very rare indeed. As if my home life wasn't tough enough, things went downhill at the office as well. Mandy, who had always been the most cheerful person I knew, suddenly became depressed. It was clear to me that something was devouring her, but no matter how hard I tried, she would not open up and would not allow me to try to help. I thought it was quite ironic that I could help strangers, but not those I knew and cared about. Between Nikki's coldness and Mandy's moping, my days became quite stressful. I've become a bit of a grouch myself, and I'm ashamed to admit that once or twice I even snapped at Mandy. I didn't mean anything by it, but I guess my remarks must have had more of an impact than I thought, because one morning she walked into my office and placed her resignation letter on my desk. "You can't do this, Mandy," I said in a panic. "You know, I didn't say that seriously the other day. Please forgive me and stay. I need you. What you said doesn't bother me, Casey. I knew you weren't trying to hurt me." "Then don't go," I said hastily. "If you can forgive me, please stay." I saw her hesitate for a moment, but then determination appeared on her face. "Sorry, Casey, but I just have to leave. It will be better this way." And before I could object or come up with some clever argument that could convince her to change her mind, she turned around and walked away. I wanted to cry. Why are all the women in my life repulsed by me? That day, I tried to call her home to see if I could get her to come back, but I discovered that she had moved out and had turned off her phone. Her mobile phone was also canceled. In fact, by asking around, I found out that neither her nor her friends knew where she was. Crap. When Mandy left, I began to appreciate even more how much she did to keep our small business running efficiently. HR provided me with a temporary assistant for administrative work, but the guy they found was not at all helpful in making column decisions. As for replacing the friendship and camaraderie that I had with Mandy, I just had to forget about it. Crap. Then something so strange happened that I forgot about Mandy for a while. One day a letter came to Aunt Agatha's email that really made me tense. "Dear Aunt Agatha, my husband is a good guy, but he will never reach any heights. Meanwhile, I began a hot relationship with a man who was destined for a great future. Now that I have the opportunity to change partners, I'm not going to miss it. Any suggestions on how to break this news to my soon-to-be ex? Looking for gold." First, I prepared a snarky response and placed it in my file of assignments to run next week. But something about the wording of the letter triggered a memory in me, and I pulled it out to look again. After a couple of minutes, I moved to the other end of the floor. "Hey, Amir," I greeted my friend. "Any chance your NSA buddy could track another message?" "Is it important?" he asked me. I hate bothering him with mundane things. "If I'm right, this could be very important," I told him. A couple of days later, Amir walked into my office with a big smile on his face. "Ask Amir, and you will be rewarded," he said pompously. "My friend found the source of your mysterious correspondent. The email was sent from a Bethesda account." He handed me a piece of paper. "Here is the legal address of the account. Does this mean anything to you?" I looked at him. "Oh yeah, that meant a lot to me. This was my home address. I couldn't believe Nikki would be so stupid as to post a letter like that to an advice column, but I didn't even understand why any of those who write would seek advice from a complete stranger. More importantly, I couldn't believe that Nikki would be stupid enough to have an affair with the clean congressman, or what he did for that matter. He was supposed to be happily married, and to make matters worse, he built his entire image on family values and morals. Now he and my wife are frolicking around the state giving campaign speeches. What hypocrisy on his part. What treachery with her. My anger grew with every second. So she's going to unceremoniously dump me to exchange me for another man? What happened to her for richer and poorer, leaving all others aside and other vows? At some point I realized that I was in a period of deep depression, but now the only emotion I felt was the thirst for revenge. I thought for a while, and then made a decision. My first step was to visit Sam Winston. Sam was the newspaper's chief political columnist. He was an old pro who really knew Washington very well. He was very kind to me when I first started, helping me become familiar with how the newsroom worked. "What can I do for you, young Casey?" he asked with a smile when he saw me. "Actually, there is something I can do for you, Sam," I told him. "What would you say if I could tell you the story of the clean congressman's secret love life with one of his assistants?" A story like this could be worth a Pulitzer Prize, he said. Then he gave me a wolfish grin. But even if this were not so, I would still like to be able to expose the weaknesses of this sanctimonious hypocrite. Then his face became serious. So what makes you think the clean congressman is doing dirty business with one of his aides? I looked at him calmly. Because this assistant of his is my wife. He blinked, but when he saw that I was serious, he leaned forward and looked at me intently. Let's talk, he said. It is quite easy to catch an adulterer who cheats on a daily basis. They are usually unimaginative and careless. Catching an elected official is another matter. Officials are usually already under close public scrutiny and therefore tend to be more resourceful. But the newspaper has significant resources at its disposal if it decides they are worth using. And after Sam approached the editor-in-chief, all these resources were put at his disposal. For obvious reasons, I was not part of the investigative team, but I was able to speed up Sam's activity in recording the congressman's sins because I had Nikki's daily routine. Keep an eye on Nikki, I told Sam, and you'll find the congressman there. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, Sam walked into my office and closed the door behind him. We caught him, he said when I looked at him questioningly. The clean congressman was definitely doing dirty things with your wife. I think deep down I had some hope that it was all a misunderstanding and that things could miraculously go back to normal. But after Sam's words, I realized that such an opportunity had evaporated. Hope dies hard, and when this happened, I found that it gave way to bitterness. When are you going to strike? I asked. How soon will I need to file for divorce? Don't worry, he said. You have time. We need to learn more about Congressman Vickers so we can make a convincing case that this is his pattern of behavior and not a one-time occurrence. And also, I want to wait until he gets closer to a nomination agreement, because then the impact will be greater. Sam smiled, but his gaze became harder. I hate hypocrites. When the congressman starts to sink, he will go to the bottom. I felt an involuntary shiver and almost felt a little sorry for what was about to happen to Nikki at the same time. Almost. My marriage had been tense before, but now it was downright icy. Nikki was hardly ever at home, and when she was, we acted more like roommates than spouses. Tellingly, Nikki didn't even notice the lack of intimacy. I thought that her thoughts were clearly elsewhere, and about someone else. Like Nikki, I spent more and more time in the office. Work was the only escape from pain. But even there, I couldn't find relief because everything in the office reminded me of Mandy. I would give anything to cry into her sympathetic ears and ask her advice. But it was as if she had disappeared from the planet. No one seemed to know where she had gone or how to get to her. I felt terribly guilty for the role my sullenness may have played in her expulsion. In the office, I consciously avoided Sam Winston territory. I was very curious what was going on, but I thought that the last thing he needed was for a pathetic cuckold to pester him with questions. However, as the party convention approached and talk of Congressman Vickers' chances of winning the vice presidential nomination began to heat up, I was eager to find out how Sam's investigation was going. So it was a relief when Sam called me one Monday and asked me to come into the meeting room in his department. As I entered, he motioned for me to close the door behind me. Everything will go down in a few days, he told me. He plans to stay at the Hay Adams Hotel on Wednesday evening, and we are going to meet him on Thursday morning. On Friday morning, the story will hit the papers, and then all hell will break loose. At that moment, I felt only relief. My fake marriage was over, and I could stop pretending to my friends and family that everything was fine between me and Nikki. There's something I think you need to hear, Sam said, interrupting my reverie. A week ago, we managed to book a hotel room adjacent to your wife's room. We have some new recording devices that are extremely sensitive, and these two weren't particularly careful. He pointed to the MP3 player on the table, then stood up and left the room. Putting on my headphones, I was prepared to hear something like an amateur porn session starring my wife. What I heard was a little different. Oh, there was a lot of sex too, with all the moaning and groaning you'd expect. But what really struck me was how emotionally dependent the congressman was, and how Nikki calmed him down. I'm much bigger than your husband, aren't I? He demanded once. Oh, yes, she purred. You're twice his size. Yeah, right, I thought. A guy with a length of 30 centimeters? I can't believe it. Tell me how much better I am than Casey, he ordered her. He never made you feel the way I do, did he? Not even close, baby, she assured him. You are the best thing I ever had. Wow, I thought. Is this guy really that complex? But the most eloquent thing came later. Herd struck me. She staged her climax. I knew what it sounded like when I pushed it to the top, but it wasn't like that. If Nikki had truly reached her peak, Sam wouldn't need sophisticated listening devices. At first I felt some male pride, that the congressman turned out to be such a pathetic lover. But thinking about it made me feel even worse. Nikki didn't leave me because she found a lover who makes her ecstatic. She left me because she found a ticket to her dream. She doesn't love this guy, I realized. She just wants to be first lady. How could I love such a flawed, selfish woman? My bitterness increased, and I was glad that I would soon end the marriage. At that moment, Sam returned to the room. Are you okay? He asked. I nodded. When you meet him on Thursday, will she be with him? I asked. Most likely, yes, he said, if they follow their stereotype. Then I want to be there, I said. He looked at me with concern. You're not going to do anything stupid, are you, Casey? No revenge scenarios or anything like that? I shook my head. Don't worry, Sam. After what I just heard, she's not worth it. All I want is the satisfaction of serving her with the divorce papers in person. He nodded. Understand, but first you have to let me and the photographer do their thing. We waited in the wood-paneled lobby of Hay Adams at 5 in the morning. The hotel staff were interested in us, but they knew all the leading reporters in the city, so they didn't bother Sam. The earpiece in Sam's ear must have conveyed the message because he turned to me and the photographer and said, "They're coming down." We stood up and grouped in front of the elevators. I stood behind. Sam looked at me sternly over his shoulder. Remember, no macho. I gave him the Boy Scout salute. I swear, Sam. At that moment, the elevator doors opened, and when Nikki and the congressman stepped out, they were struck by the flash of a photographer's camera. After blinking several times, the congressman finally recognized the man standing in front of him and quickly recovered. Hello, Sam. It's always great to see one of our top journalists at work. But is it too early to ask questions? The reporter ignored his remark. Congressman Vickers, could you comment on why you and your assistant just left her room so early in the morning? We must give the guy credit. He turned out to be resourceful. Of course, Sam. Nicole and I had a short meeting to discuss my schedule for the day. It's clear. Then could you explain why this quickie meeting in her room started at 11 p.m. last night and continued without interruption, completed a few minutes ago? Sam continued. Well, how can I say? The congressman stumbled and tried to regain his mental balance, but Sam didn't give him time. Perhaps this photo of the two of you from earlier this month will shed some additional light on your relationship. Sam continued, showing them the photo. Sam showed it to me earlier. The photographer used a powerful telephoto lens to capture the two of them embracing high up in the glass-walled elevator on the front of the Marriott Hotel. What made the photo so damning was that the congressman lifted Nikki's skirt, and his hand was clearly visible, squeezing her thong-clad butt. The couple hugged for only a few seconds, but this was enough for the lens to capture a juicy photo. How do you think this will affect your position on family values, Congressman? Sam continued inexorably. While the confrontation between the congressman and Sam took place, Nikki stood in shock, her eyes darting wildly around. Suddenly they focused on me, and she screamed, "Casey! What are you doing here?" It was a signal if I ever got one, and I stepped forward to meet her face to face. "I'm here to personally deliver this divorce petition to you," I said evenly, thrusting the papers into her hands. She gasped. "Oh, by the way," I continued, "if you are still waiting for an answer to your question to Aunt Agatha, you will find it in today's edition of the newspaper." With these words, I handed her the morning newspaper, opened my column, and turned away. "Wait!" I heard her behind me. How could you?" I looked over my shoulder and saw her looking at the first question in the Ask Aunt Agatha column. "Dear Aunt Agatha, my husband is a good guy, but he will never reach any heights. Meanwhile, I began a hot relationship with a man who was destined for a great future. Now that I have the opportunity to change partners, I'm not going to miss it. Any suggestions on how to break this news to my soon-to-be ex? Looking for gold." Dear gold seeker, don't worry. Your husband already knows everything, and he has already left you. Some of my readers were a little puzzled by Aunt Agatha's answer, but I was writing for an audience of one, and I was pretty sure she got the point. When Sam's story was published on Friday morning, there was a media frenzy. There seemed to be a lot of people who didn't like lectures on morality, especially when the accuser was made out to be a sinner. The first news was almost immediately followed by the announcement that the clean congressman was no longer being considered for the party's vice presidential nomination. Shortly after this story broke, Congressman Vickers' wife appeared live on the Oprah Winfrey Network. Oprah tenderly comforted a crying woman while loudly criticizing her philandering husband in front of millions of Oprah viewers. The divorce that followed was very public and messy. In the end, the congressman made the foolish decision to run for re-election in his district. He suffered a crushing defeat and subsequently completely disappeared from the political scene. Very good, I thought. His name may go down in history, but only as an example of shame. As for Nikki, she was hounded by tabloid reporters who wanted to get the inside story about the other woman. I changed the locks on our apartment, so she was forced to temporarily move in with a friend. When the paparazzi became too annoying, she left town and eventually moved back in with her parents. Our divorce went quickly. Nikki could hardly argue adultery as grounds for divorce after being exposed on national news. She tried to contact me once or twice, but I made it clear that all communications had to go through my lawyer, and she stopped trying. We split what little we had equally, and since the syndication deal was not yet completed, she didn't get a penny of it. When my role in the expose was revealed, I became something of a celebrity in the newspaper. But when people started asking too many questions, somehow my boss would show up and growl at them until they left. He was a stubborn sparrow, but I found that I actually appreciated him, even with his rudeness. I thought I would feel better after my divorce from Nikki, but instead, I felt more depressed than ever. I didn't miss my ex-wife, but I missed what we had before all this started, a loving relationship. I was angry that she took all this from me. I went on dates a few times, and it was fun, but I kept thinking, we swam, we know. One day I was sitting at my desk, wallowing in self-pity, when I found myself daydreaming about Mandy. I felt terrible again for sending her away, not only for her, but for myself. I began to think about office romances and suddenly remembered a letter from Aunt Agatha, to which I responded several months ago on this very topic. I had to dig through my files to find it, but after a lot of searching, I found it. Rereading it, I decided that I had been rather harsh towards the girl who wrote it, and wondered how I would answer the same question today. Then a wild thought struck me, and I checked the date of receipt of the letter. Is it possible? I rushed to Amir's workplace, clutching the letter in my hand. Amir, I know it's a lot to ask, but could you ask your NSA buddy to check another email? Please, it would really mean a lot to me. He reluctantly took my email address. This must be very important, he said sternly. Believe me, I said, this is a matter of life and death. The next time I saw him, he had a pained expression on his face. I don't know what you're trying to find out, Casey, but this letter came from here, from the newspaper office. I knew it! I knew it! I shouted, and hugged the frightened technician. Of course, it could only be Mandy. She developed feelings for me, but she didn't know what to do with them. And I, as I understand it, actually ordered her not to meddle in my life. No wonder she dropped everything and left town. What an understanding advisor I was. I had someone truly special right under my nose, and I didn't even realize it. Not only did I not notice her, I even managed to drive her away. I had to find her. But no matter where I went, I always found myself in a dead end. Her old friends had never heard of her. She closed her Facebook page. HR would not allow me to review her job application due to confidentiality concerns. But a friendly clerk told me off the record that she had not identified anyone in the immediate family through whom I could try to contact her. The University of Missouri hasn't heard from her since she graduated. My lonely love life, my depression over a bad marriage, and my complete inability to find the one person who really mattered to me. Besides, my parents were all starting to affect my work. It got to the point that one day my boss stuck his head in the door and growled at me. "Look at the poor little boy crying over spilled milk. Look, you idiot, you better get your head out of your ass and fix this, or your syndication deal will die before it's even born." His words were harsh, but I think they were what brought me out of my stupor, because I rolled up my sleeves. I came here for my job and didn't want to lose it. Damn it, I thought. If I can pull off Aunt Agatha as well as Nikki and Mandy, I'll really win the stupidity competition. And it was true. I actually loved Aunt Agatha and all her readers, even if I was as ignorant as they were. And suddenly, an idea came to me. She was crazy, utopian, and probably naive, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Dear Aunt Agatha, I was working with a woman who was everything I ever wanted, but because of everything else going on in my life at the time, I didn't realize it. As a result, I let her go, and now I don't know how to find her. What can I do to correct the biggest mistake of my life? The blind man of Bethesda. Dear blind one of Bethesda, your only hope is if she ever finds out how you feel and gives you another chance. But if she ever does, you better not let her get away again. I know. What a stupid, meaningless gesture this is. But I had to try, if only for my own peace of mind. One afternoon, a few days later, I was called upstairs to the office. Several lawyers and the editor-in-chief himself were waiting for me there. I had only met him once, so I was very scared. But he soon reassured me by telling me that the purpose of the meeting was to sign a syndication contract for Ask Aunt Agatha. Once I sign my name on the dotted line, my little daily column will be distributed in newspapers across the country starting next week. From now on, the newspaper and I will begin to divide the weekly proceeds from the deal in half. To make things even sweeter, the boss told me with a smile that the number of newspapers willing to reprint Aunt Agatha had grown from 12 to 22 during the negotiations, and in 6 months it could increase even more. Once the papers were signed and I had shaken hands with everyone around me, I returned to my small office in a daze. For the first time in my life, I had the prospect of making serious money, assuming I could keep my little goose that laid the golden eggs. I may not have become a crusader reporter like Woodward and Bernstein, but I am making a living in my chosen field, and may have even given some good advice to my readers. I should have been delighted, but I wished I had someone to share my good fortune with. After work, I went with a group of other reporters to have a couple of beers, but didn't say anything to them. I knew that rumors would spread sooner or later, but I didn't want to brag about my luck. After leaving the bar, I spent a quiet evening at home. I called my family to tell them the good news, but I had to ask them not to tell anyone. Officially, Aunt Agatha's identity was still a secret, although I knew that eventually the truth would come out. The editor-in-chief mentioned something about keeping it a secret until they were ready to launch the advertising campaign. My family was delighted with me, but my mother was disappointed that she could not show off her son to her friends. My father was still a little embarrassed about what I was doing, but happy that I looked financially independent for the foreseeable future. The next day, I was diligently sorting through a new stack of letters when I heard a timid knock on the doorframe. I looked up, but at first I didn't see anyone. Then a hesitant voice said, "Casey?" I recognized this voice. "Mandy!" I shouted, and then jumped over the table, papers flying everywhere. I grabbed her and desperately hugged her. "I thought I lost you," I told her. And then I kissed her, and there was a roar in my ears. A minute later, when the roar had not stopped, I looked up and saw the corridor in front of my office filled with applause and shouts from my fellow editors. Mandy looked at me guiltily. "They kind of followed me when I was looking for you," she said. Finally, the commotion died down, people began to return to their desks, and only my boss remained. He looked closely at Mandy. "It's time for you to return," he said. "That idiot hasn't been worth a damn since you left." As he left, I whispered in Mandy's ear, "For the first time in my life, I absolutely agree with him. Dear Aunt Agatha, despite everything, the woman I lost has returned to me, and she is even more beautiful than I remember. What should I do now?" The blind man of Bethesda. Dear blind one of Bethesda, ask her to marry you as soon as possible, you idiot. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.